Okay. We are continuing our study of the life of Abraham. And if you are getting tired of this study, you are in luck because today will be our last day. We are going to focus on the last details of Abraham's life and his death as recorded in Genesis chapter 25. So you can go ahead and turn over there. We will not actually read through all of Genesis 25. We'll just be reading through the first, I guess, half, first third. I'm not sure how you want to divide that. But that's where we'll be once I get my notes up here. So last week we finished up Genesis chapter 24, where we have the story of Abraham's chief servant who goes and gets a wife for Isaac and brings back Rebekah, who is a granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. And so that detail is included really for what's going to happen later on after Abraham's life, because it kind of sets the stage for what will happen not just to Isaac and Rebekah, but also to their descendants, Jacob and Esau. And of course, Jacob will have his 12 sons, which will become the 12 tribes of Israel. We might reference that, but we're not going to read that. As I said before, we're going to stop kind of partway through chapter 25. But let's go ahead and begin reading. Someone read for us Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 4, please. 1 through 4. Okay, thank you. Rose is always good about reading the ones with all the names for us. Does it pretty well, so I'm not going to complain about anything. So getting into chapter 25, this is kind of a weird, sudden, last-minute inclusion here that is often forgotten when we talk about the life of Abraham. It's that he had another wife after Sarah died. And maybe wife isn't maybe the best term. I think when we talk about verse 6 in a little bit, it might indicate she was more of a concubine. The idea is that she would not have necessarily the same status or rights as Sarah would have. Her children do not have the same inheritance rights as Isaac do, as we'll see in a little bit. But at least this verse, most translations will say that Keturah was his wife. Now, verse 6 may muddy those waters a little bit, but I'm bringing it up now so we're not confused when we get there. But it's interesting here because up to this point, Abraham had one son with Hagar, named Ishmael, and you had one son with Sarah, named Isaac, and that was it. And then it seems suddenly here at the very end of his life, he has 6 more kids. So in his very, very old age. Now remember, he was 137 when Sarah died, and that was 2 chapters ago. So he's past that age, and yet he's having a whole bunch more kids. I don't know where, I don't think I'd want to do that at such an old age. I don't think I could take it. I guess he's got servants that can help take care of the kids. I don't know. That seems like a lot of energy. It sounds exhausting. But so he has these kids, and I'm not going to go through all 6 of them in any detail. We're going to get another Genesis chapter 10 study here if I do that, and I really want to finish this study. But I do want to point out that these are mentioned here for a reason. It gives us a broader kind of scope and depth of the world that is going to exist post Abraham's life. For an example, the one I want to point out is Midian here. Midian does play a role later. We do see Midianites later. We'll see some of these others as well, but Midian's kind of the big one. For example, pretty early on in Exodus chapter 2, when Moses flees for the first time, he departs from Egypt by himself, and he goes out into the wilderness, sort of, and then he meets some Midianites there. He marries Zipporah, and Zipporah's father is described as a priest of Midian. So and there's some controversy with some of the Israelites. Well, she's not an Israelite. How could Moses marry a non-Israelite? well, she's also still technically a descendant of Abraham here, which is a really interesting thing. We think that these are very different people, but they have actually a very close bloodline. I mean, we're going to talk about much, much later generations by that point, but they do have a common ancestor in Abraham, which is really interesting. Midianites will not always have necessarily good relationships with the Israelites later on, but at least in that case, there is a very interesting and good connection there. That's really all I'm going to say about the first 4 verses. Again, I don't want to really delve into what happened to these people and their nations after, because again, that's going to be a much longer study than I really wanted to go into. I want to keep the focus on Abraham a little bit. But any comments or thoughts on these first 4 verses before we get into the next 2? I'm really breaking these up a lot more than I usually do. Okay, someone read for us. This is just a small section. Verses 5 and 6, please. 5 and 6.
And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had. While he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east.
Okay. So verse 5 makes it clear that Isaac is really the sole heir to Abraham's estate, if you will. Everything that is Abraham's becomes Isaac's. It's not going to be split among all of these sons that he has. Isaac is going to get everything. He is the son of the promise. Now, it does say that Abraham still gave some gifts, and I want to say that's probably like a certain amount of provisions and wealth that he sends them off with. And he's still kind of taking care of them, but he's getting them away out from Isaac. This is very much like what happened if you look back in Genesis chapter 21 when Sarah had concerns about Hagar and Ishmael and how they might affect Isaac coming up and being the son of promise and being the heir. They sent them away, and we have the details of that pretty well laid out for us in chapter 21. So it seems like a very similar thing is happening here, that Abraham did a very similar thing where he sent them off, but he sent them off with something so that they weren't just kind of scratching it on their own, not having anything. They were not destitute. They were provided for, but everything else is going to go to Isaac. It makes it pretty clear about that. And so this son of promise, all of that estate is going to continue on to Isaac, and then to his descendants on after him. Again, that's going to be a little bit post his life, and we're not going to get to that too much, but we see kind of this pattern continuing where Abraham really does care about his other sons. It's not just all about Isaac. We remember he had concerns about Ishmael. He didn't want to lose his other son that he did care about, and it seems he also cared about these other 6 sons, so he's going to make sure they're provided for, they're taken care of, but he is going to send them off away from Isaac so that Isaac will be the sole inheritor. Any other comments up through verse 6? Go ahead, Jeff.
In our culture, we are so accustomed to trying to get guaranteed setups or incomes or whatever. We have tenure, we have guaranteed retirements. We work so that we can kind of then not work. In ancient times and in most cultures in the world today, you have to make your way. You have to do your job. You have to carry out your responsibility. Even the Bible says each one will bear his own burdens. But while I know there's a point at which we can't do that physically, that's certainly understandable. But this idea, and even in some places in the world, people want to retire at 50 or 55, and this idea that then the society will take care of them the rest of their life. We need to understand that even if we do, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with guaranteed incomes. It's the idea about bearing our burdens and fulfilling our responsibilities and making a contribution to the family or to the society or whatever. This is part of what we are to do in this life, to work with our own hands, to mind our own business, and to keep ourselves, set a good example for those who are outside. 1 Thessalonians 4:12 says that. So anyway, just to note that while they were given some provisions, Hagar
Yeah, and that's kind of again, we don't have as much detail here in 25, but if we look back at the example with Hagar and Ishmael, they aren't given much. In fact, they run out of water at one point, so they really didn't have that much, but they had enough to get by, to get them started, to make their own way. So it's not that Abraham was sending these children off into the wilderness with absolutely nothing, and they would never make it. He's going to make sure that they're going to be taken care of. And of course, with the example of Ishmael especially, God talks to Abraham and kind of comforts Abraham, saying that he's going to watch over and he's going to be a great nation also. Now, we know that some of these other sons did have other nations and stuff come from them. Certainly never became quite as great as some of the others, but we do have mentions of them later in the Bible. They had their own peoples. They had their own families. They made their way. I don't think we can rule out the providence of God in that regard also.
God said, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So inasmuch as they were family to Abraham, they blessed him, they were good to him, they brought joy to him in his old age, I'm sure the Lord did take care of him.
Yeah, I don't really have any doubts about that, especially with the ones we see mentioned later on. Very good. Any other comments through verse 6 here? We're rolling right along. We're going to get this study done. We're going to do it this time. You can't stop me. All right, let's get on to the last part that we're going to do here of Genesis 25. We're not going to go beyond this. So this last section will be verses 7 through 11. If someone would read that for us, please.
This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his son Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite. The field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth, where there Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt in Beer-lahai-roi.
Okay, thank you. So that is as far as we're going to read as far as the text. I will reference things beyond that, but that's going to be our last section of reading. So Abraham dies at the age of 175 years old. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I don't think I'm going to make it quite that far. We have this described here as a good old age. So this would indicate to me that this is considered a very long life, even in the time of Abraham. Now, when kind of going back a little bit, you can think of our Genesis 10 study a little bit. From the period between the creation and the flood, it was extremely common for people to live 500, 600, 700, 800, even 900 plus years old. We have several recordings of that. And then when you get to the flood and the periods after, they're still living long lives compared to us, but they start to get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. So by actually the time you get to Abraham being on the scene, Shem, the son of Noah, is actually still around, even though it's been like a whole bunch of generations. But each generation's life gets shorter and shorter and shorter. So, Abraham is not living nearly as long as some of those people, but in his time, this is still considered a long life. So I mean, to us, 175 years, that's a good old age. No one ever makes it that far anymore. But in that time, well, back then, they lived a lot longer. But even now, up to this point in this generation, this was considered a long life. So I wanted to point that out again. And it's really interesting, we still see, even after his life, some people living over 100 years old, but not living quite as long as this. I don't think, if I remember correctly, Ishmael nor Isaac lived quite as long as this. So again, you see kind of the ages for how long people live get shorter and shorter, even after Abraham's life. And it's also showing that Abraham here continued to live well after some of his major life events, points where he was already considered a very old man, which is really interesting. You look back and consider that Abraham lived another 75 years after Isaac is born. Now remember, the whole time, basically from the start, Abraham is called this old man and he doesn't have any children, and that's basically the story from Genesis chapter 12 up to Genesis chapter 21, is he's this old man who doesn't have any kids, he's not going to be able to have any kids, but he lives another 75 years after that. and then has 6 more kids. It's quite amazing. And he also lives another 38 years after the death of Sarah. Sarah died at 127, so he would have been 137 at the time, and he lives another 38 years after that, which is amazing to think that there were some major life events, and you would say, well, that's got to be the end of his life because whatever he had to do is fulfilled. But he lives a long time after that, so there was plenty for him to do that we don't have a ton of details about. I think probably the most detailed story we have is when he sends out his servant to go get a wife for Isaac. And really not much after that. We get a short description here of Keturah and her sons, and that's really it. But certainly there was a lot going on that we just don't have written down. Things that Abraham did because he was certainly living his life well after those major events that we think about. And it says here that he was buried in the same tomb as his wife Sarah. If you go back to Genesis 23, that's where we have the story of him purchasing the property from the Hittites, kind of this whole negotiation thing that went down, and him buying that land for the purpose of burying his wife. And I've mentioned this before in the study, but Sarah and Abraham are not the only people who will be buried in this tomb. We'll get mentions of it later on in the Bible. I think Jacob is the one that talks about this, that Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob are all going to be buried later in this same tomb. So it's going to be, it's not just a single tomb or a couple's tomb, it's a family tomb. So it must be, there's some space in it. But that's kind of the thing that's passed on all the way into, well, really until they take the promised land, because they have to take Jacob's bones out with them to do that. So it's a very interesting stuff that happens there. Or no, that'd be before. It's Joseph's that they take with them after that. So it's actually before the Exodus proper. Let me see. One other thing I think is interesting to mention here is it mentions that both Isaac and Ishmael are present for the burial of Abraham. Now, we're not given a lot of detail as to what their present personal situation between them is. Isaac and Ishmael obviously had some, or at least Ishmael had some issues with Isaac, and that's why Sarah suggested sending them off in the first place. We don't know if Ishmael harbors any resentment toward Isaac or vice versa. If there's any issues between them, it doesn't say. But even if they did, their love and their respect for their father Abraham supersedes all that because they're doing this together. This is the only time we see them together after Ishmael was sent away, and we don't see them interact ever again after this. So they come together just for this moment. This may be, another way to say, well, Abraham must have been a good dad because his kids are getting along and working on this together to kind of pay their respects and make sure that their father is buried. I think that's maybe another testament to his perhaps being a really good dad. That's kind of my opinion as I read through the life of Abraham. He seems to really care about all of his sons. Verse 11 mentions that God continues to bless Isaac after the death of Abraham, and that Isaac was living in the area of Beer Lahai Roi. Now, this is the same place that Isaac was at the end of Genesis chapter 24. This is kind of near the area of the Negev, which is a wilderness, on the south end of what would be the nation of Israel. This is, funny enough, I didn't mention this last time when we were talking about Genesis 24, but this is actually the same spot where the angel of the Lord spoke to Hagar when she first tried to run away when she was being abused by Sarah after she became pregnant with Ishmael. It's the same location. I didn't put that together the first time we went over that in the last chapter, but it's interesting how it's kind of a small world. I don't know if that was on purpose, that Isaac did it for that reason. I don't think so, but it's just kind of interesting detail there. So Isaac is continuing to receive the blessings that his father Abraham did in his life. So we see that God is with Isaac as well. It's not one of these things where Abraham dies and God says, Isaac, well, you're on your own, kid. Good luck. There's going to be kind of this special relationship through those generations, continuing on with the Israelites and the nation of Israel. And it's pretty much, this is the end of Abraham's role in the book of Genesis. As I said, we're not going to continue on any readings for this study. I have a few more things I do want to talk about. But we're not going to continue on reading. But if we were continuing through chapter 25 rather, what we'll see in the following verses is talking about the descendants of Ishmael. I've mentioned before, he will go on to have 12 sons and 1 daughter. which is an interesting parallel with Jacob, who would later be called Israel, who had 12 sons and 1 daughter himself. And then if you continue on past that point, starting in verse 19, that's where we'll see the beginnings of Isaac's descendants, Jacob and Esau. And if we continue on through the rest of the book, it mostly is going to follow Jacob to a point, and then it's going to start talking about his sons. There's going to be a focus on Joseph for a bit. And then there's going to be this reconciliation with the whole family. They're going to be down in Egypt. And that's where Genesis is going to end. And I just want to mention, if you ever do a study of Exodus, if you're reading through Genesis, you're like, well, I want to start Exodus now. You have to remember there's a huge chunk of time between Genesis and Exodus. In Genesis, the family is together in Egypt. They're all having a great time. Joseph is second in command of Egypt. When you flip the page into Exodus, suddenly that whole nation is now enslaved by the people of Egypt. So certainly there's a big change that happens there. And a lot of the things that were prophesied or talked about in Genesis will begin to come to fruition after that point in Exodus. So we're not going to get to all that. I just, if you were to continue on, that's what we would start reading about. Any comments on the reading itself? I'm going to talk about a few other aspects before we're done with the study, but any comments about these verses we've read in chapter 25 or anything else anyone wants to ask or comment?
I was asked one time if these children born to Abraham after Sarah died, and the emphasis that the text put on Abraham and Sarah's age, if these children of Keturah negated the miracle of Sarah's birth, of Isaac's birth. And of course, my answer was no, because the Bible says it was an act of God that enabled her. She was barren, not like she had other kids and then stopped having kids and just had one late. She never had any kids before at all. So that is the primary miracle. But who's to say God didn't have a providential hand in these other children as well? He may well have.
And again, part of that is we just don't have a lot of details. My guess is Keturah was probably a lot younger than Sarah. That's my guess.
And not barren.
Right. And so it seems that there is a difference here, but we're not given a lot of those details. So I kind of have maybe a similar thought as you on that question. And especially because, it does say, this was miraculous, but every time we kind of look through Abraham's life, every time he's described as this old man, and he's concerned about it. He talks to God about it in one chapter. My estate's going to go to a servant because I don't have a son, and God has to constantly reassure him that it's going to happen. The promise is going to be fulfilled, but it's not going to happen in the way you think or in the time that you think. If there was something miraculous about these other 6 children, I don't know for sure, but it seems to be a little bit different as far as that situation goes. Yeah. Any other comments? Go ahead, Arnold.
Yes, and I believe we have to keep in mind that this is right after the flood. So, the emphasis was of God was repopulating, and this is one way to do it: long lives, finish children, but the lineage between Abraham and God's people, he specified how it was to go, and that's why you see, I believe, the brothers sort of marrying into each other, each clan.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I would describe it as being right after the flood. We do have several generations. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. But if you go through, chapters 10 and 11, we are actually quite a bit away from the flood, especially because people are living long lives. And also recall back before the flood, a lot of the interesting details is like some people would not be fathers until they're like 60 years old, 90 years old. But then again, they're living like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's one of those things I don't think we'll truly understand. It's like, do they just age slower? And if they do, does that make the gestational period a lot longer? And that sounds really not nice and comfortable. That's a whole thing I don't really want to get into. But that's where the mind goes. Is like you try to figure out, well, how did this work? God made it work somehow. But you are right in the fact that there is this effort to repopulate the earth. There were 8 people that came out of the ark. That's it. That's not a lot to start with. You could say, well, in the garden there was only 2. I could say they had a lot longer to work with, because we see that these lifespans get shorter and shorter and shorter. In fact, we're going to talk about the size of the family tree in a little bit. I'll get there, but there was also, there's a couple things. I think we've talked about this a little bit. One thing is, if you're going to have workers or you want to build a nation, you kind of have to make that population personally, because you can't just go hire somebody to build you a city. Well, you got to make people who can then build that city, because those people don't exist yet. There's not a lot of labor to go around. Or if you're going to have a battle, well, where are you going to get those soldiers from? They got to be born. Kind of a famous, maybe not a famous enough quote because I don't remember it exactly, but Napoleon Bonaparte, he compared recruiting soldiers to a crop yield. You're going to get a new crop of soldiers every year because people are being born. And actually, if you look at history, there are some world leaders, even to today, that will have, they will give awards to women who bear a certain amount of children, because they know that, well, this will give us a certain amount of worker labor or a certain amount of soldiers that we can then use to be more powerful as a nation, things like that. And in this time, that's especially the case. We read about Abraham's fighting in chapter 14. He has about 100 some servants that go out and fight. It's not very many, but that's about all you need in that time to have a good security force, because the populations do exist. They are somewhat advanced, I think probably more than we think, but they are not, we do not have megalopolis cities like New York or Tokyo or anything like that. We're far removed from the multi-million people cities. I think in Jonah, when it talks about the city of Assyria, which is considered a great city, I think the population was said to be 120,000, something like that, which, well, we think that's not that much. Columbus is almost that big. But in that time, that's considered a very big city. So yeah, there's definitely some valid points to what you're saying on that. It's very much a different time in Abraham's era. And that's always something to keep in mind, is when we're reading through Old Testament, especially passages, even New, though. I would say New Testament was a different time too. We have to remember the context and what the world was like in that time. The landscape can be different. We talked about the trees that are mentioned throughout Abraham's life. Those trees don't exist anymore. Where'd they go? What happened to them? But we also got to know that the cities were different. They were different sizes. The populations were different. Part of the reason, though, that I think we see a lot of intermarrying was Abraham and his descendants were trying to avoid marrying with the Canaanites, because we've talked about this too, how many times that presented problems. Not that it didn't ever happen and not be a problem. We have examples where that's the case as well, but oftentimes it was because of idolatry that would be introduced because of those unions. Very good. Gretchen, go ahead.
Do we have any more information about Keturah, like what her bloodline was?
Not in Scripture, not in the Bible. Now, I didn't delve into Jewish or Christian traditions. Basically, anytime the Bible doesn't say much about something, you'll find a tradition about it. You have to kind of be careful about trusting them a little much. I mentioned this way back when we did our Genesis 10 study. Basically, if you look at some traditions, there are some that describe what I would essentially just boil down to wizard battles between Abraham and Nimrod. But the Bible never speaks of them having any interaction. Now, a lot of traditions do, but the Bible doesn't speak to that at all. And some of them are just really grandiose descriptions that I'm like, God probably could have had that happen, but I don't think that's probably how it happened, kind of territory. So you got to just be very careful about some of those, because when you look at extra biblical texts, there's usually a reason they're not in Scripture, because God didn't see fit for them to be there. Not that they're necessarily all untrue. I think some do have a lot of truth to them, but we do have to be careful about calling them fact.
Well, my question is it reading too much into it when you're looking at Abraham as a God-fearing man for 100 and however many years before he married Keturah, and he listened to God's words, and is it reading too much into it to say, well, if this man married a woman, he probably married a woman either that God sort of presented to him or that he knew was a really good woman.
And we don't know, because we don't get a lot of details. And that's the thing, is we get into danger a little bit when we try to just kind of guess or suppose this must have happened. Now, we might have evidence in some instances where we don't have a lot of detail that would suggest, well, maybe it was like this, but I can't say because I don't know, because the Bible doesn't say. So I'm always very careful about that. If I ever talk about, this is may have how it happened, I'm going to make it clear that I don't know that for sure, and that maybe we're basing it off of some peripheral evidence or things like that. Like if we go back to Genesis chapter 24, was that servant Eliezer of Damascus that was mentioned earlier in Genesis? Maybe. We're not told that. He's never given a name. It would make sense if it was, but we don't know. And so that's kind of how, as far as we can get with that. So I really don't know. It would be really interesting to know that stuff, but we don't need to, I guess, because God didn't put it in there for us to know.
But he did have it put in there that these men were, these other extra, what was it, 6, 7?
6, yeah.
6, that Abraham loved them, that he provided for them, and that, if he's following God's word, he's not supporting the enemy.
Well, and I think probably the bigger reason in having this included is really for a historical purpose. Because this is all written down. The primary audience is the Israelites. That would come later. And they would want to know, where did we come from? They would want to know Abraham, the Exodus, all that stuff. Excuse me. And that's why these things were written down. They were the primary audience. So they would want to know about the life of Abraham. He's kind of the focus. But, having these other people mentioned, such as Midian I brought up, that nation came from somewhere. And it mentions this nation also came from Abraham. And it's really interesting. I've mentioned this before. I'll mention it again quick. It's really interesting to see how many of the nations that eventually kind of occupied the area of Canaan, almost all of them have some connection to Abraham of some kind. Once you get south of the area of Sidon and Tyre, it's basically kind of all Abraham's descendants until you get to Egypt. To a degree, there's going to be pockets of Canaanites that still remained after the conquering of the land, but it's really interesting to see Abraham really did dominate the land, even if not all of them were Israelites. So that would include people like Midian or Esau or Moab, Ammon. They all have some connection of some kind to Abraham, which is really interesting. We'll get into that in a second. Any other comments of the reading part?
One more real quick.
Sure.
You said call them Israelites, and I'm going, Israel wasn't Jacob also called Israel. And so that would imply that they would have been from Isaac.
Yep.
All of those. So if you're an Israelite, you are from Isaac and not from any of these other sons.
Yeah, if you were an Israelite, you would be a descendant of Isaac, a descendant of Abraham. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I want to do a couple visual kind of notes here to help us, in one way, recap what we've studied, but also because I wasn't good about keeping my maps updated and going through the family tree. So I want to do all that at the very end because, honestly, it just gets complicated. So just kind of to help us understand how much has happened in Abraham's life. Remember, Genesis chapter 11, the latter part of Genesis chapter 11 tells us that Terah was the father of Abraham. Abraham was called Abram at that time. Was in the land of Ur, was traveled up to the area of Haran, and that's where Terah died. And then we get into chapter 12, we have Abram, that's what he's called at the time. He goes from Haran, he's called by God to go through the land of Canaan. He passes through Shechem, and he goes between Bethel and Ai, which would be next to Jericho here. And then he goes all the way down through the Negev to Egypt. Remember, there's that famine. That's why he goes to Egypt. But of course, there's that whole issue of, this guy says this is his sister, but it's actually his wife. You all probably remember that story pretty well. So he kind of is told to leave. So after he leaves, chapter 13, he goes back through Bethel and Ai, and it talks about eventually he and Lot separate in that chapter, in Genesis chapter 13. Of course, we know that Lot goes down south here to the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then we have Abraham, who is described as going to Hebron. I'm going to skip to another map here. Maybe. My battery didn't die on me. Jeff, are you messing me up over there? He's... Yeah, I see you messing. No, that one. There we go. I want to go to this map. We have Genesis chapter 14. we have the area of Sodom and Gomorrah down here. We have this four-king coalition. I've talked about how sure we are about these locations. It's a decent map. Maybe not exactly the way I would have it, but we have the four-king coalition that comes down, defeats the five-king coalition, plus actually a lot of other people that we kind of talked about. And then they take Lot with them. And so Abram goes in pursuit. His men go as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus, to get Lot back. He comes back. He's met by the king of Salem and the king of Sodom. They have that whole interaction there. I'm going to go back to my other map. In Genesis chapter 20, so this is skipping ahead a little bit, Abram is now in the area of, he's in the area of the Negeb toward the city of Greer, which is a southern Philistine city, and that's where we are introduced to Abimelech, the king of Greer. We have that whole, this guy says it's his sister, but it's actually his wife situation again. You may all remember that pretty well. He stays in that land for a little while. Then they make a treaty at Beersheba in chapter 21. Then when we get to chapter 23, that's when Sarah dies. We see he's back in the area of Hebron, negotiating with the Hittites to buy the land to bury his wife Sarah. And then when we get to Genesis chapter 24, we're back in the Negev with Isaac. Now, it's not clear whether Abraham was with Isaac down there, but we know Isaac was. But then, of course, when he's buried again, his tomb would be back up in the area of Hebron. So he's gone kind of all over the place up through basically modern-day Iraq, all the way kind of north to, this would be like Syria, down through the Holy Land to Egypt, and then back again, and has wandered all around that area. So he's traveled a lot. He really is a nomad. The other slide I want to look at, Jeff. Let's see here. Okay, this one here. So this is Abraham's family tree when we first start in Genesis chapter 11. This is the latter part of chapter 11 where it talks about Terah and the family that he has and those that he brings with him. So we have Terah up here, Abram and Sarai, as they were called at the time. He implicates later that to Abimelech that they are actually half-siblings. I'm going to believe that's true. We don't see anything to the contrary of that. So it means they would have had separate mothers, but they would have had the same father. So I have question marks up there because we don't know anything about them. We have Abram's brothers Nahor and Haran. Haran has Milcah and Iscah and Lot. Of course, we know Lot traveled with Abraham quite a bit. We never hear about Iscah again, but Milcah, we know, marries her uncle Nahor. And that plays in later. So that's where we are at the very beginning of the record of Abraham's life. And then it turns to this by the end, which I know you can't read this, but that's kind of the point, this is huge. This is, if we get to the end of chapter 25, so I included, the verses that talk about Ishmael's descendants, well, most of them, and then Isaac's descendants, but then I stopped after 25 because then it just gets ridiculous. Any of you who map out family trees will know this. So Terah is up here again. This is Sarah and Abraham. This yellow, that's our line of promise. So we have Isaac, Jacob, who will become Israel later on. There's Esau. Esau's descendants will become the Edomites. That will kind of inherit an area south of the Dead Sea, kind of southeast of Israel. And then this purple line here, that's Milcah. That's to indicate that that's the same person. So that's Nahor's descendants right here. Here we get Bethuel. Remember chapter 23. We have that story of Isaac getting a wife. So that's Rebekah. That's where she comes in. So I put her over there too. Laban is going to play a big role again later in Genesis when Jacob is leaving to flee from Esau. He goes and hangs out with Laban. Laban will have two daughters, Leah and Rachel. They will both marry Jacob. Them and their handmaids will actually be the mothers of all the 12 tribes of Israel. Those are not included in this. Again, it would get ridiculous. I'll run out of space. This is Lot over here. The red is to indicate his daughters and what they did after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But that makes up Moab and Ben-Ammi, who become the Moabites, and the Ammonites, who also then have territory on the east side of Israel, on the east side of the Jordan. So again, more of Abraham's descendants taking up that space. So that's the descendants of Haran. Then here, this is Ishmael. Ishmael had 12 sons. Again, I did not put all of their descendants also. Again, be too much. We know he got a wife. Talks about Hagar got him a wife from Egypt. Got to remember Hagar herself is an Egyptian. And then this is Keturah here. So this whole block right here is the descendants of Keturah. So Midian is included right here with his sons as well. So this is a big family. It's a lot different from this kind of a little humble, a few sons, a few wives, and then we get into this, well, I would call it a monstrosity. It's probably not a nice thing to say, but it took me a long time to put together. It really shows that God pulled through on his promises because we see all these people, all these nations that come from these people. Of course, Israel, Jacob, whatever name we want to use for him, he's going to have 12 sons. He's going to have daughter. Those 12 sons are going to be the 12 tribes of Israel that you will read about Exodus and beyond. So again, there's a lot more that will be added onto this past chapter 25, but I had to cut it off somewhere, so I'm cutting it off there. So I think that's just a really great visual kind of reminder about how God works. I wanted to keep that included for you. So that's the end of our study of Abraham. I know I'm over my time, so I'm going to wrap it up. Next week, we're going to do something else. I'm not going to tell you what it is because, I'm kind of stuck between two things. I don't know which one I want to do yet. So we'll be doing something else next week, but we're done with Abraham. We're past our time, so we'll just close it there. Thank you.